On a
We
peaceful
must preserve
suburban
this
street
tree for
lined
the
with carefully
neighborhood.
The
maintained
proposal
homes,
needs community
trimmed hedges,
approval
and
before
freshly painted
removal.
mailboxes, there stood an enormous oak tree that seemed older than the neighborhood itself. Its sprawling branches stretched gracefully over one corner lot, casting cool shade across the front yard and part of the quiet sidewalk. Every spring, birds built their nests among its leaves. Every autumn, children delighted in watching its golden leaves drift gently to the ground. In summer, neighbors often paused beneath its shade while walking their dogs or chatting with one another. To most people, it was simply a beautiful tree. To Margaret Ellis, it was family. At 72 years old, Margaret had lived in the same house for nearly 40 years. Her late husband, Thomas, had planted the oak as a tiny sapling shortly after they moved into the neighborhood. It had been one of the first things they did together before unpacking a single box. Over the decades, the little tree had grown alongside their family. It witnessed birthday celebrations in the front yard, graduation photographs beneath its branches, holiday decorations carefully hung every December, family picnics during warm summer afternoons. It even stood quietly through the hardest moments of Margaret's life, including the day Thomas's funeral procession slowly passed the home he had loved so dearly. Whenever Margaret looked through her living room window, she never simply saw an oak tree. She saw memories. She saw love. She saw nearly 4 decades of her life standing proudly before her home. After Thomas passed away 6 years earlier, Margaret found comfort in caring for both her house and the tree they had planted together. Every Saturday morning, she watered the flowers surrounding its base, gently removed fallen branches after storms, and occasionally hired certified arborists to ensure the oak remained healthy. The specialists always reached the same conclusion. The tree was exceptionally healthy. Its roots were stable. Its trunk was solid. Its branches posed no unusual safety concerns. In fact, several arborists commented that such mature oak trees had become increasingly rare in rapidly developing suburbs. Margaret treasured every one of those reports. Life inside the neighborhood remained peaceful for many years. Residents greeted one another with friendly smiles. Children rode bicycles safely along the sidewalks. Neighbors borrowed gardening tools, shared homemade desserts during holidays, and helped each other after severe storms. The community wasn't perfect, but kindness often outweighed disagreements. That atmosphere slowly began changing after a new homeowners association board was elected. The previous board had focused mainly on maintaining shared spaces and resolving occasional maintenance issues. Most homeowners rarely thought about the HOA because it stayed largely invisible. The new leadership approached things differently. Its newly elected president, Ronald Pierce, believed strict enforcement demonstrated effective leadership. Shortly after taking office, he introduced a series of aggressive neighborhood inspections. Letters began appearing in mailboxes every week. One homeowner received a violation because their grass measured slightly taller than allowed after several days of heavy rain. Another family was cited for leaving bicycles visible beside their garage. A retired couple received warnings because flower pots did not match approved community colors. Gradually, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. People spent less time talking with one another. Instead, they worried about unexpected violation notices. Ronald considered the growing number of citations evidence that he was improving property values. Others quietly wondered whether the neighborhood was losing something much more valuable. Margaret generally avoided conflict. She maintained her home meticulously. Her lawn remained trimmed. Her flower beds looked beautiful throughout the year. Her house often received compliments from passing neighbors. She believed she had little reason to fear the new HOA leadership. Then one unexpected letter arrived. It appeared ordinary from the outside. Inside, however, its contents stunned her. The notice informed Margaret that her oak tree had been designated an architectural compliance concern. According to the letter, the tree allegedly obstructed neighborhood visual consistency, produced excessive leaf debris, and created potential liability concerns for the association. The notice demanded removal of the tree within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and possible legal action. Margaret reread the letter several times. Surely there had been some mistake. The tree had stood there long before many current residents purchased their homes. It had never caused property damage. Professional arborists regularly confirmed its excellent condition. Nothing about the demand made sense. She immediately searched through old neighborhood documents. The original community landscaping guidelines specifically encouraged preserving mature trees whenever possible. Confused, Margaret scheduled another inspection with a respected certified arborist. Within days, the specialist completed a thorough evaluation. His written report concluded exactly what previous inspections had found. The oak was healthy, structurally sound, not hazardous, properly maintained. Its removal was unnecessary. Margaret felt reassured. Surely presenting professional evidence would resolve the misunderstanding. She submitted the report to the HOA office together with photographs documenting decades of responsible maintenance. Several days passed. Then another letter arrived. This one contained even stronger language. The board acknowledged receiving the arborist's report but stated that community appearance standards gave the association authority to require removal regardless of the tree's health. The compliance deadline remained unchanged. Margaret felt something she rarely experienced. Fear. Not because of the tree itself, but because she realized logic alone might not solve the problem. The oak represented far more than landscaping. Removing it would erase a living piece of her family's history. Meanwhile, several neighbors quietly noticed the situation unfolding. Many had admired the tree for years. Some remembered watching it grow from a young sapling. Others appreciated the shade it provided during hot Texas summers. Few understood why the HOA suddenly wanted it removed. Yet most hesitated to become involved. They worried about drawing unwanted attention to themselves. The growing culture of fear inside the neighborhood had begun discouraging ordinary acts of support. Only one neighbor openly visited Margaret. Daniel Morales lived directly across the street with his wife and two young daughters. He had often seen Margaret reading beneath the oak on warm evenings. His daughters loved collecting acorns every autumn. When he learned about the removal notice, he felt deeply unsettled. Daniel worked as an environmental engineer. Years of experience taught him the importance of preserving mature trees whenever possible. Beyond their beauty, they reduced neighborhood temperatures, improved air quality, prevented soil erosion, and increased property values. Removing a healthy mature oak made little environmental or financial sense. He carefully reviewed Margaret's arborist report. Everything appeared professionally documented. Everything supported keeping the tree. Daniel quietly began researching local ordinances. What he discovered surprised him. The city maintained specific protections for certain mature trees based on trunk diameter, age, and ecological significance. Removing qualifying trees often required permits and detailed justification. Failure to obtain proper authorization could result in substantial penalties. Daniel wasn't yet certain whether Margaret's oak qualified, but he suspected it might. Rather than alarming her with incomplete information, he decided to investigate further before saying anything. Across the neighborhood, Ronald Pierce prepared for the next monthly HOA board meeting. Among routine agenda items sat Margaret's property. To Ronald, the issue seemed straightforward. Rules existed for a reason. Compliance demonstrated authority. Exceptions weakened leadership. He never considered the emotional significance of the tree. He never questioned whether the board possessed sufficient legal authority. He simply believed enforcement proved effectiveness. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't cruelty. It's certainty without curiosity. As the compliance deadline steadily approached, Margaret continued caring for the oak exactly as she always had. She watered the flowers. She swept fallen leaves. She rested beneath its shade each evening, wondering whether those peaceful moments might soon disappear forever. She gently touched the rough bark with weathered hands, remembering the young couple who had once stood in that exact spot holding a tiny sapling filled with hope for the future. She silently promised Thomas she would protect their tree for as long as she could. Unbeknownst to Margaret, Daniel's research was beginning to uncover documents that could completely change the course of the dispute. Hidden inside decades-old city planning records lay information the HOA board had apparently overlooked, or perhaps never bothered to examine. If those records proved what Daniel suspected, the battle over one old oak tree was about to become far bigger than anyone in the neighborhood imagined. And the next chapter would determine whether memories rooted in 40 years of love could survive the growing power of an HOA determined to make the final decision. The days following the second HOA notice felt longer than any Margaret Ellis could remember. Every morning she opened her curtains and looked toward the great oak standing proudly in the front yard. The sunlight filtered gently through its broad canopy exactly as it had for decades, painting soft shadows across the grass Thomas had once carefully tended. Nothing about the tree had changed. Only the threat surrounding it had. What had once been a symbol of comfort had become a daily reminder of uncertainty. Margaret continued her normal routine despite the growing anxiety. She watered the flowers surrounding the trunk, collected fallen twigs after windy afternoons, and quietly sat beneath the branches each evening with a worn family photo album resting in her lap. Inside those pages were nearly 40 years of memories. There was the picture of Thomas kneeling beside the tiny sapling with dirt covering his gloves and a smile stretching across his face. Another photograph showed their son climbing the tree's lower branches during childhood. Another captured their daughter's high school graduation beneath the spreading canopy. Every major chapter of their family story seemed connected to the oak. The tree had never simply occupied the yard. It had witnessed an entire lifetime. Across the street, Daniel Morales continued researching long after finishing his work each evening. His background as an environmental engineer made him unusually familiar with municipal regulations involving mature trees. What had begun as curiosity slowly transformed into determination. Something about the HOA's demand felt legally questionable. He visited the city's online planning archives, reviewed environmental protection ordinances, and examined neighborhood development records dating back more than 40 years. Hours of searching eventually led him to a document few people had likely seen in decades. It was the original landscape preservation agreement filed when the subdivision was first developed. The agreement contained an unexpected section regarding heritage vegetation. Several mature trees, including one large oak located on what later became Margaret's property, had been specifically identified for preservation because of their age and environmental value. Developers had agreed to protect them whenever reasonably possible. Daniel's pulse quickened. He continued reading. Another city ordinance stated that removing designated heritage trees required not only a permit but also approval from the city's urban forestry division after a formal inspection. Private homeowners associations could not simply order removal without satisfying those legal requirements. Daniel compared the property maps with modern aerial photographs. Everything matched perfectly. Margaret's oak appeared to be one of the protected trees. If his interpretation proved correct, the HOA's order might not only be unreasonable. It might be unlawful. Rather than jumping to conclusions, Daniel contacted the Urban Forestry Division the following morning. A city arborist agreed to review the historical records. 2 days later, the official called him back. The answer removed every remaining doubt. Margaret's oak was indeed listed as a protected heritage tree. Its age was estimated at more than 90 years, meaning it had already stood long before the neighborhood itself existed. Thomas had not planted the oak from a seedling after all. He had carefully preserved and nurtured an already established young tree when building the family home. That discovery made Margaret love it even more. Thomas had often joked that the tree was the oldest resident on the street. He had unknowingly been telling the truth. The city official explained that removing such a tree required extraordinary justification. Disease, severe structural instability, irreparable storm damage. None of those conditions existed. Professional inspections consistently described the oak as exceptionally healthy. The HOA's explanation regarding visual consistency carried virtually no weight under city regulations. Daniel thanked the official and requested written confirmation. Within hours, official documentation arrived. He carefully organized every page before walking across the street. Margaret welcomed him with her usual warm smile, though exhaustion now rested behind her eyes. The past week had drained much of her energy. Daniel gently placed the documents on her dining room table. As she slowly read each page, confusion gradually transformed into hope. For the first time since receiving the HOA notices, she realized she might not be powerless after all. The law recognized something she had always believed. Some things carried value beyond appearances. Meanwhile, HOA President Ronald Pierce prepared for the monthly board meeting. He fully expected Margaret to request additional time before complying. Instead, he intended to recommend immediate fines if the deadline expired. He viewed the dispute as an opportunity to demonstrate firm leadership. Several board members quietly shared his confidence. Only one member, retired accountant Susan Blake, privately questioned whether the association had acted too aggressively. She had reviewed Margaret's maintenance history. The homeowner had never received a violation in nearly 40 years. Removing a healthy tree seemed unnecessarily harsh. Still, she hesitated to challenge Ronald publicly. Like many people, she found disagreement uncomfortable. The meeting began with routine business. Financial reports, maintenance updates, landscaping contracts. Then Margaret's property appeared on the agenda. Unlike previous meetings she had attended over the years, this time Margaret arrived carrying a neatly organized folder instead of quiet optimism. Daniel accompanied her for support, though he remained seated among other homeowners. Several neighbors also attended. Word of the dispute had quietly spread throughout the community. People wanted answers. Ronald confidently summarized the alleged violation. He described concerns regarding neighborhood appearance and future liability. He presented the issue as though the outcome had already been decided. Margaret calmly submitted the certified arborist reports confirming the oak's excellent health. Ronald acknowledged receiving them but dismissed their significance. Then Margaret presented the city documentation. The atmosphere changed immediately. Board members leaned forward. Susan carefully adjusted her glasses and began reading. Another director requested copies. Ronald's expression remained composed, but uncertainty quietly entered his face. The documents clearly identified the oak as a protected heritage tree. They also explained the city's permitting requirements. Several board members exchanged concerned glances. The legal implications became obvious. If the HOA forced removal without proper authorization, both the association and any contractor involved could face significant penalties. Ronald attempted to maintain control of the discussion. He suggested the city records might be outdated. Daniel quietly provided recently issued confirmation from the Urban Forestry Division. The documents bore official city seals and current signatures. There was little room left for argument. For the first time, Ronald realized the board might have acted beyond its authority. Yet pride often resists surrendering even when facts become undeniable. Instead of immediately withdrawing the demand, Ronald proposed obtaining the HOA attorney's opinion before making any decision. The board reluctantly agreed. Another 2 weeks would pass before the matter returned for review. Margaret left the meeting feeling cautiously hopeful. The threat had not disappeared. But neither had the truth. Outside the community clubhouse, several neighbors approached her. Many admitted they had admired the oak for years. Some confessed they had wanted to support her earlier but feared attracting HOA attention themselves. Their honesty saddened Margaret. Not because they had remained silent. Because fear had become so common that kindness required courage. Something unexpected happened over the following week. Neighbors began stopping beneath the oak more frequently. Children played nearby after school. Families took photographs beneath its branches. Longtime residents shared stories of community picnics once held in its shade decades earlier. The tree quietly reminded people of the neighborhood they had once loved. A neighborhood built on friendship rather than fear. One afternoon, a local newspaper reporter contacted Daniel after learning about the dispute through city records. The situation interested her because it represented more than a disagreement over landscaping. It reflected a growing conversation happening in communities across the country. How much authority should homeowners associations possess? Where should enforcement end and common sense begin? The article appeared online 2 days later. Photographs of Margaret standing beneath the magnificent oak accompanied the story. Within hours, readers flooded the publication with comments. Most supported preserving the tree. Many criticized excessive HOA enforcement. Environmental organizations shared the article. Local gardening groups praised Margaret's dedication. The story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Suddenly, the dispute no longer belonged only to one homeowners association. It had become a public conversation about community values. Ronald watched the growing attention with increasing frustration. He believed outsiders misunderstood the situation. Yet every interview, every photograph, and every city document pointed toward the same conclusion. The HOA's position appeared weaker by the day. Still, the final decision had not yet been made. The association's attorney had begun reviewing every document submitted by both sides. His legal opinion would determine whether the board continued fighting or admitted its mistake. As another quiet evening settled across the neighborhood, Margaret sat beneath the oak while a gentle breeze rustled its leaves overhead. For the first time in weeks, hope felt stronger than fear. She rested one hand against the tree's weathered trunk and silently reflected on everything it had survived. Storms, droughts, changing seasons, generations. Perhaps one more challenge remained before peace could finally return. Inside the HOA office, however, an envelope containing the attorney's official legal review had just arrived. By the following morning, its contents would force the board to confront a truth far more difficult than losing an argument. It would force them to choose between protecting their pride or protecting the very community they had been elected to serve. Morning sunlight spread gently across the neighborhood as birds settled into the branches of the great oak. To anyone passing by, it appeared to be another peaceful day. The tree stood exactly as it always had. Strong, steady, unmoved by the controversy surrounding it. Inside the HOA office, however, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The association's attorney had completed a thorough review of every document, ordinance, inspection report, and historical record connected to Margaret Ellis's property. The thick legal opinion rested in front of every board member as they gathered for what would become the most important meeting in the community's recent history. Unlike previous discussions, confidence had disappeared from the room. Even Ronald Pierce, who had built his leadership on certainty, now understood that the facts deserved more respect than assumptions. The attorney's conclusion left little room for interpretation. Margaret's oak qualified as a protected heritage tree under city regulations. Every certified arborist had confirmed it was healthy and structurally sound. The HOA possessed no legal authority to require its removal simply because of aesthetic preferences. Attempting to enforce the order could expose the association to significant legal liability, financial damages, and public scrutiny. The recommendation was direct. Withdraw the violation immediately. Cancel all fines. Issue a formal correction. Several board members quietly lowered their eyes as they finished reading. The room felt unusually heavy. No one celebrated. No one argued. Everyone understood that the issue had grown beyond a disagreement about landscaping. It had become a question of leadership. Leadership was not measured by how aggressively rules were enforced. It was measured by whether those rules were applied with fairness, wisdom, and humility. Ronald remained silent longer than anyone expected. For weeks he had defended every decision with unwavering confidence. Now he faced something much harder. Admitting he had been wrong. Pride often convinces people that apologizing weakens authority. Experience eventually teaches that refusing to apologize weakens it far more. The board voted unanimously to withdraw the violation notice. Every proposed fine was canceled. The removal order was permanently rescinded. The association also agreed to cover Margaret's legal consultation expenses and reimburse the cost of obtaining the certified arborist reports. It was an important decision. But everyone knew paperwork alone could not repair what had been damaged. Later that afternoon, Margaret received an official letter delivered by hand. Unlike the earlier notices that had filled her with anxiety, this envelope carried relief. The violation had been dismissed. The oak would remain. She slowly read the letter twice before stepping outside. The familiar shade welcomed her once again. She rested one hand against the rough bark and quietly closed her eyes. For weeks she had feared losing the last living reminder of the life she had built with Thomas. Now that fear finally lifted. It was not victory she felt. It was gratitude. Across the street, Daniel Morales smiled as he watched Margaret standing beneath the tree. He never considered himself a hero. He had simply chosen to ask questions instead of accepting assumptions. That single decision had changed everything. His daughters ran across the lawn collecting fallen acorns, laughing exactly as children had done there for decades. Margaret smiled. Their laughter reminded her of her own children many years earlier. Some traditions deserved to continue. News of the HOA's reversal spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents who had remained silent during the dispute began talking openly. Many admitted they had been uncomfortable with the removal order from the very beginning. Others confessed they had worried that speaking up would make them targets of future enforcement. The dispute revealed something many homeowners had quietly felt for months. Fear had slowly replaced community. People realized they had stopped knowing their neighbors because they had become too busy worrying about violation notices. That realization inspired change. At the next community meeting, attendance reached its highest level in years. Instead of discussing landscaping violations or paint colors, residents began discussing transparency. They proposed clearer communication between the HOA and homeowners. They suggested independent reviews before major enforcement actions. Several residents recommended creating a committee focused on preserving the neighborhood's mature trees and green spaces. For the first time in a long while, the meeting felt less like a courtroom and more like a community. Even Ronald listened carefully. The experience had humbled him. He recognized that rules without compassion eventually lose the respect they seek to create. Several weeks later, Ronald visited Margaret's home. He walked slowly toward the front porch beneath the same oak he had once ordered removed. Its enormous branches stretched overhead, providing welcome shade on a warm afternoon. Standing beneath the tree, he finally saw what paperwork had never shown him. He noticed the initials carved discreetly into one side of the trunk decades earlier by Thomas and Margaret shortly after moving into the house. He saw family photographs displayed through the living room window, many featuring the oak in the background. He noticed the flower bed Margaret lovingly maintained around its base. For the first time, he understood that the tree was not simply part of the landscape. It was part of someone's life. He offered a sincere apology. Margaret accepted it with quiet grace. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it prevented the past from controlling the future. That simple act of forgiveness surprised many people who later learned about it. Some expected bitterness. Margaret chose peace instead. She believed resentment was another kind of burden, and she had already carried enough weight. The story continued spreading beyond the neighborhood. The local newspaper followed up with another article highlighting the HOA's decision and the city's confirmation of the tree's protected status. Environmental organizations praised the outcome. Neighborhood associations across the region discussed the case during board meetings. Some communities reviewed their own landscaping policies to avoid making similar mistakes. What began as one homeowner's struggle gradually became an example of responsible leadership and civic awareness. The city itself recognized the significance of the oak. A few months later, representatives from the Urban Forestry Division installed a small bronze plaque near the sidewalk. The plaque identified the tree as a protected heritage oak and briefly described its historical importance to the community. Visitors occasionally stopped to read it. Children often asked their parents why the tree had a special marker. Those questions created opportunities to share an important lesson. Not every valuable thing can be measured in dollars. Some things become priceless because of the memories they hold. As the seasons changed once again, the neighborhood slowly rediscovered its sense of connection. Neighbors greeted one another more often. Community picnics returned to the small park nearby. Families organized volunteer gardening days. The atmosphere became warmer, less fearful. People realized that protecting a neighborhood involved more than maintaining property values. It required protecting trust. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret sat beneath the oak with a cup of tea resting beside her. Golden leaves drifted gently around her, covering the grass with familiar colors she had watched appear every year since moving into the home. Daniel's daughters laughed nearby as they gathered acorns for a school project. Birds continued building nests among the branches. Life moved forward exactly as it should. Margaret looked toward the sky filtering through the leaves and thought of Thomas. The tree they had cherished together still stood. Not because it had won a battle, but because truth had taken deeper root than power. The dispute had taught everyone something unexpected. Communities are strongest when rules serve people, not when people exist merely to serve rules. Authority earns respect only when it listens before judging. Justice begins with facts. Compassion gives justice its meaning. The great oak remained standing through another winter, another spring, another summer, and another autumn. Its roots reached deep into the earth, just as its story reached deep into the hearts of those who witnessed it. Long after meeting minutes had been forgotten. Long after newspaper articles disappeared. Long after board members changed. The tree continued offering shade to strangers, shelter to birds, and memories to generations yet to come. Some victories are measured in court decisions. Others are measured in preserved history. And sometimes, the strongest thing in a neighborhood is not the authority that tries to remove a tree, but the quiet courage of one woman who refused to let love, memory, and truth be cut down.